In a scene that could only be described as both shocking and absurd, Daniel decided to take matters into his own hands by using a chainsaw to remove his fence, and the neighborhood was about to witness a spectacle they would never forget. As he revved up the chainsaw, the sound echoed through the quiet suburban streets, drawing the attention of curious neighbors who peeked out from behind their curtains, jaws dropping in disbelief. The sight of Daniel, clad in a flannel shirt and safety goggles, wielding a chainsaw like a modern-day lumberjack, was enough to send shockwaves through the community. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as onlookers struggled to comprehend what was unfolding before their eyes. Meanwhile, Karen, the self-appointed HOA queen, was not about to let this act of rebellion go unchallenged. Her eyes widened in horror as she rushed outside, her perfectly coiffed hair bouncing with each determined step. "Daniel, you can't do that!" she shouted, her voice a mix of disbelief and indignation. The chainsaw roared louder, drowning out her protests, and the tension in the air was palpable. Karen's face turned a shade of crimson as she realized that her authority was being directly challenged in the most dramatic fashion possible. This was no longer just about lawn decorations. It was a full-blown declaration of war against the HOA's iron grip on the neighborhood. As Daniel continued to slice through the wooden slats of his fence, the crowd's shock morphed into a mix of excitement and apprehension. Would this act of defiance spark a revolution against the HOA's stringent rules, or would it only escalate the conflict between Daniel and Karen? The stakes were higher than ever, and the neighborhood was on the edge of its collective seat, eager to see how this outrageous showdown would unfold. When Daniel first moved into the neighborhood, he was filled with excitement and dreams of a fresh start. The charming house with its white picket fence seemed like the perfect place to settle down. However, his enthusiasm quickly took a nosedive during his first encounter with Karen, the self-proclaimed HOA president. As he unloaded boxes from the moving truck, he noticed a figure approaching with an air of authority that immediately put him on edge. Karen, with her clipboard in hand and a no-nonsense expression, introduced herself with a smile that felt more like a warning. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Daniel. I'm here to help you get settled," she said, but her tone suggested anything but friendliness. Before he could respond, she launched into a list of HOA regulations, her voice dripping with the kind of authority that left no room for negotiation. "Now, I just wanted to remind you that we have strict guidelines regarding lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, and, of course, holiday decorations," she stated, her eyes narrowing as she scanned his belongings. Daniel felt a knot form in his stomach as she handed him a printed list of violations that he had already committed, before he had even unpacked a single box. "You'll need to remove those moving boxes from the front yard by tomorrow, and I noticed your mailbox doesn't meet our standards," she continued, her tone unwavering. What had started as a dream quickly turned into a nightmare, as Daniel realized that his new home came with a hefty dose of unwelcome scrutiny. The excitement of moving in faded as he felt the weight of Karen's authoritative presence looming over him. Instead of the friendly neighborhood he had envisioned, he was faced with a rigid enforcer of rules that seemed designed to stifle creativity and individuality. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he had unwittingly stepped into a world where joy was secondary to compliance, and his heart sank at the thought of what lay ahead. The conflict surrounding Daniel's fence began innocently enough as he sought to create a little privacy in his backyard oasis. The fence was a simple wooden structure, painted a cheerful shade of blue that complemented his home's exterior. For Daniel, it was more than just a boundary. It was a sanctuary where he could unwind after a long day, enjoy barbecues with friends, and let his dog roam freely without the prying eyes of the neighborhood. However, Karen, ever vigilant in her role as the HOA president, saw the fence as a direct affront to her vision of neighborhood uniformity. Her complaints began with a seemingly innocuous note left on Daniel's door, citing a violation of the HOA's strict guidelines regarding fence aesthetics. "The color is not in line with our approved palette," she wrote, her words dripping with authority. But as Daniel read on, he couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of her claims. Karen insisted that the fence was distracting and out of place, as if a splash of color could somehow disrupt the delicate balance of their suburban utopia. Her overreaction was palpable, and it quickly became clear that this was less about the fence itself and more about her desire to exert control over every aspect of the neighborhood. As the conflict escalated, it became evident that the power dynamics at play were deeply rooted in the community's culture. Karen thrived on her role as the enforcer of rules, relishing the authority it gave her over her neighbors. Daniel, on the other hand, represented a challenge to her reign, embodying the spirit of individuality that she sought to suppress. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on the other residents, who watched with a mix of amusement and disbelief as Karen's complaints spiraled into a full-blown crusade against Daniel's fence. This clash of wills highlighted the underlying theme of control in the neighborhood, revealing how a simple fence could become a battleground for power and personal expression. After weeks of enduring Karen's relentless complaints about his cheerful blue fence, Daniel found himself venting to his friend Jake over a couple of beers one evening. "I'm telling you, Jake, I'm done playing nice," Daniel declared, frustration bubbling over. "I'm thinking about going nuclear on this whole situation." Jake raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean by going nuclear?" he asked, leaning in closer. Daniel grinned, a mischievous glint in his eye. "I'm going to build a steel barricade, something that'll really make a statement and show Karen that I won't be pushed around." Jake laughed, but he could see the determination in Daniel's eyes. "You're serious, aren't you?" he replied, shaking his head in disbelief. This could escalate things even further. But Daniel was already lost in his vision, imagining the look on Karen's face when she saw the imposing structure. Over the next few days, he meticulously planned the construction of the barricade, sketching designs and gathering materials. He envisioned a formidable wall of steel, complete with spikes and a bold sign that read, "Private property, keep out." As Daniel worked on the barricade, he felt a rush of excitement. He enlisted the help of a few friends, and together they transformed his backyard into a construction zone. The sound of metal clanging and tools buzzing echoed through the neighborhood, drawing curious glances from neighbors who were both intrigued and apprehensive. The anticipation of their reaction hung in the air like a thick fog. Would they support Daniel's bold move, or would they side with Karen and her rigid adherence to HOA rules? As the barricade took shape, Daniel couldn't help but imagine the chaos it would unleash. Would Karen come storming over, clipboard in hand, ready to issue yet another violation? The thought made him chuckle. He was ready to embrace the absurdity of the situation, knowing that this was more than just a fence. It was a declaration of independence in a neighborhood that had become a battleground for control and conformity. As the steel barricade rose in Daniel's backyard, the neighborhood was enveloped in a stunned silence that felt almost palpable. Residents peered out from behind their curtains, eyes wide with disbelief as they took in the sight of the imposing structure. Whispers and gossip quickly spread like wildfire, with neighbors exchanging incredulous glances and hushed conversations. "Did you see what Daniel is doing?" one woman exclaimed to her friend, her voice barely above a whisper. "A steel barricade? What is he thinking?" The absurdity of the situation was not lost on anyone, and the community buzzed with a mix of shock, amusement, and curiosity. Meanwhile, Karen was in a frenzy, her attempts to halt the construction becoming increasingly frantic. She stormed over to Daniel's property, clipboard in hand, her face flushed with indignation. "You can't do this," she shouted, her voice rising above the sound of metal clanging. "This is a violation of HOA regulations. You need to stop this immediately." But Daniel, fueled by a newfound sense of defiance, merely smiled and waved her off, relishing the chaos he had unleashed. Karen's protests fell on deaf ears as she paced back and forth, her frustration mounting with each passing moment. As the barricade neared completion, it became the talk of the town. Neighbors gathered in small groups, debating the implications of Daniel's bold move. Some expressed support for his right to express himself, while others sided with Karen, fearing that this act of rebellion would set a dangerous precedent. What's next? A moat? One neighbor joked, eliciting laughter from the group. The barricade had transformed from a mere construction project into a symbol of resistance against the HOA's stringent rules, igniting passionate discussions throughout the community. The mixed reactions only fueled Daniel's resolve as he reveled in the attention his barricade had garnered. It was no longer just about a fence, it was a statement that challenged the status quo and sparked a lively debate about individuality versus conformity in their tightly knit neighborhood. The absurdity of the situation had turned into a spectacle, and Daniel was ready to embrace every moment of it. As the steel barricade loomed larger in Daniel's backyard, Karen was determined to take action, and she quickly turned to legal means to challenge his audacious construction. Fueled by indignation, she meticulously documented her complaints and submitted them to both the city and the HOA board, outlining her grievances with fervor. This barricade is not only an eyesore, but also a blatant violation of our community's aesthetic standards, she wrote, her words dripping with authority. Karen's complaints painted Daniel as a reckless neighbor who threatened the very fabric of their suburban paradise, and she was convinced that the powers that be would side with her. To bolster her case, Karen enlisted the help of Mr. Patterson, the HOA's lawyer, a stern man with a reputation for being relentless in enforcing community regulations. Mr. Patterson was known for his no-nonsense approach and his ability to navigate the legal intricacies of HOA disputes. When he arrived at the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, he wasted no time in assessing the situation. "This barricade is a clear violation of the HOA bylaws," he declared, his voice authoritative as he surveyed the scene. With Karen by his side, he began drafting a formal complaint that would challenge Daniel's right to construct the barricade, threatening legal action if it wasn't removed. However, Daniel remained unfazed by Karen's threats and the looming presence of Mr. Patterson. In fact, he found the entire situation amusing. As he sipped his morning coffee, he chuckled at the thought of Karen and her legal tactics. "Let them come," he said to Jake, who was visiting to check on the progress of the barricade. "I'm not backing down. This is my property, and I have every right to express myself." Daniel's confidence only grew as he imagined the spectacle of a legal showdown, viewing it as an opportunity to further highlight the absurdity of the HOA's rigid rules. While Karen and Mr. Patterson plotted their next move, Daniel continued to enjoy his newfound sense of freedom, fully aware that the conflict was far from over. The neighborhood was abuzz with anticipation, and he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, determined to stand his ground against the forces of conformity. The pivotal town hall meeting was set to be a defining moment for the neighborhood, as residents gathered to discuss the controversial steel barricade that had become the center of a heated conflict. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, and the room buzzed with whispers as the neighbors took their seats. Karen, eager to rally support for her cause, stood up to address the crowd, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone commanding attention, "we cannot allow Daniel's barricade to stand. It's not just an eyesore, it's a direct challenge to our community's values and the rules we all agreed to uphold." Karen's speech was filled with passionate appeals, as she painted Daniel as a reckless neighbor who threatened the harmony of their suburban haven. "If we let this go unchecked, what's next? A fortress in every backyard?" she exclaimed, her eyes scanning the audience for nods of agreement. She urged her fellow residents to stand united against this act of defiance, hoping to ignite a collective outrage that would sway the board's decision. However, the HOA board, composed of members who had grown weary of the ongoing drama, responded with a measured tone. While we understand the concerns raised by Karen, we must also consider property rights and individual expression, one board member stated, attempting to strike a balance. The board's response seemed to deflate some of Karen's momentum, but she quickly regained her composure, determined to press on. Just as the tension in the room reached its peak, Daniel seized the opportunity to counterattack. Rising from his seat, he addressed the crowd with a calm yet assertive demeanor. Before we get too caught up in the barricade, let's talk about something that truly affects us all. The HOA's financial misconduct, he declared, his voice echoing through the hall. Gasps rippled through the audience as he detailed discrepancies he had uncovered in the HOA's financial records, highlighting questionable expenditures and lack of transparency. Daniel's unexpected revelation shifted the focus of the meeting as residents began to murmur among themselves, grappling with the implications of his claims. The barricade, once the focal point of the discussion, now seemed to pale in comparison to the potential scandal brewing within their own community. The stage was set for a showdown that would not only determine the fate of Daniel's barricade, but also challenge the very foundation of the HOA's authority. As the dust settled from the town hall meeting, Daniel knew he had to take decisive action to back up his claims about the HOA's financial misconduct. He enlisted the help of a sharp lawyer, Lisa, who specialized in community association law. With her expertise, they began to dig deep into the HOA's financial records, and what they uncovered was nothing short of shocking. At the next HOA meeting, Daniel and Lisa arrived armed with evidence that would turn the tide of the ongoing conflict. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he presented a meticulously organized dossier filled with documents, spreadsheets, and photographs that highlighted Karen's questionable financial dealings. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but filled with conviction, "I have here evidence of misappropriated funds, inflated expenses, and even personal purchases charged to the HOA account." As he laid out the details, the room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. He pointed to a series of invoices that showed payments made to contractors who had done work on Karen's personal property, all billed to the HOA. Gasps of disbelief rippled through the audience as they processed the implications of what Daniel was revealing. The community's reaction was swift and visceral. Whispers of disbelief turned into murmurs of outrage as residents began to question Karen's integrity and the legitimacy of her leadership. "How could she do this to us?" one neighbor exclaimed, while another added, "We trusted her to manage our community." The atmosphere shifted dramatically, and the once unified front that Karen had relied upon began to fracture. As the board members exchanged uneasy glances, it became clear that the power dynamics within the HOA were shifting. Karen, who had once wielded her authority with an iron fist, now found herself on the defensive, her credibility crumbling before the very people she had sought to control. The community, emboldened by Daniel's revelations, began to rally around him, recognizing that they had the power to demand accountability. The tide had turned, and the once dominant HOA president was now facing the very real possibility of removal from her position. The balance of power had shifted, and the residents were ready to reclaim their community from the clutches of corruption.